Okay, guys, so just to continue a little bit and give you a sample, that's what I really want to do in this. But I know I ran out of time in the last video, so we're really looking at this last part of the analysis. All of these paragraphs are just really part of your analysis section. And the very last part of your analysis section is basically saying, for these reasons, it seems like this particular argument, is more, significant or is the stronger argument. You're just kind of noting, in a sense, the direction that you're going to go, and then your conclusion is something that's going to be just really, really specific. So I'll show you an example of this, and I'm going to use a student work. So I know it's a little hard to see, because we're looking at this being just a Word doc, trying to see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you guys, so I can just kind of view maybe a little bit bigger. We're going to zoom in just a tad, maybe 130. Okay, let's see if that helps. Okay, so this is Isabella Hong's assignment from last year. Great student. She did an awesome job on this, so I thought it would be a useful one to consider. Her question, and she's a student who really was interested in Dresden during World War II. The United States bombed the German city of Dresden, and the bombing campaigns, had huge effects on the local population, pretty much destroyed the city, and she was very interested in some of the, moral and ethical decision making behind Dresden. So she was a student who maybe initially started off with a question that had to do with, was the bombing of the city of Dresden during World War II something that was morally justifiable or whichever. That became along the way hard for her to measure, so she started to consider, how much did the bombing of Dresden really achieve the Allied goals of halting the wartime production and manufacturing and breaking German communication lines. So she kind of decided the reasons why the American and Allied military wanted to target Dresden, was for some type of military gain, right? To what extent was it really effective in achieving that? And kind of inherent in this was, was the military goals and the way that this was done. Did it kind of have higher value in a sense than the ethical cost of things? Okay, so in any case, that's what her question was, okay? And she kind of went about this question because it was a little bit measurable. Just like all of you and creating your final HI, she starts out with a table of contents. It includes the plan of investigation, the summary of evidence, evaluation of sources, analysis, conclusion, and then the works cited page. You can see her entire paper is about 14 pages in length. That's about spot on, and she separated all of her sections, okay? So here we have the plan of investigation. Let's note a few things about this. She has some context in the beginning. On February 13th, the British bomber command, consisting of 800 bombers, dropped this amount of bombs and incendiaries on Dresden. And this investigation will cover the decision over the action of this bombing, the importance and contribution of Dresden to the German wartime effort before the bombing, and the contribution to the wartime effort after the bombing. So she's looking at some of the effects and the reasons for this bombing. The purpose of this historical investigation is to analyze to what extent the area bombing on Dresden was effective in achieving the goal of the Allied powers, halting the production, communication, and contribution to the wartime effort of Dresden. How much does it really kind of take out any military power that Dresden might offer? Much research will be done using journal articles, analyzing pre-war military plans, government records, first-hand experiences, and the book Dresden, by Frederick Taylor, okay? She has a summary of evidence. We don't need to go over every single piece of it. Just note that there's some context part of this, morals and ethics throughout World War II. So there's some descriptions of how the Allies documented, in a sense, what their limits would be on bombing campaigns, different points of view on American bombing campaigns. So some of what makes this particular HI so good is because the content is so specific and spot on. So I can't emphasize that enough. Really good HIs have really good summaries of evidence, and this one is is that, okay? There's also a section on Dresden. What about Dresden? Why the city of Dresden was important, what the Allies were worried about, why it was targeted, choosing Dresden. So, and then the really key part of her HI is this last section for the summary of evidence, what would be the effects, okay? So there's a great deal of detailed evidence here about why the Allies and the Americans in particular attacked Dresden, what actually happened, photographic intelligence reports that showcase what actually happened and why what was done was done. The telephone system was taken out, 12,000 dwellings were totally destroyed, workers were significantly reduced, 2.5 thousand workers were reduced to 500. So she's kind of describing some of the detail with this bombing campaign, right? Who was affected and, some of the points of view. Churchill, the English Prime Minister, saying that, bombing German cities was the sake of increasing terror. This should be reviewed. So, people that had concerns about it. So you can look at this. I will leave this plan of investigation and the summary of evidence, this paper for you. This student also has the evaluation of sources. So we get a sense, this particular first source is from the Journal of American History. It is somebody who is talking about American military ethics in World War II, the bombing of German civilians. So clearly a source that's connected to this topic. It is very much about the issue of military ethics and the decisions of bombing German cities. It is not specific to Dresden, which is something that the student noted in her limitations, right? There's value in the content for this variety of reasons. It provides a standpoint to the Dresden ethics controversy. She talks about how a value might be the viewpoint of this, describes that actions were not morally justified. So if you were bucketing sources, you would put this source kind of in the argument that, bombing Dresden was not morally justified. However, the source does have a limitation. It is Dresden is only a small portion of the entire journal article. It's kind of consistently about a variety of different German cities. This second source, right, is by an historian who's a British historian. He studied history, specializing, traveling throughout Germany, contributing to his knowledge about World War II. There's a description of the author and then a description of the value and the limitation, right? So this author supports the bombing of Dresden, and it really focuses on specifically that decision, okay? All right, so the analysis is really the section that we want to get into, okay? The very first paragraph that this student developed is context, okay? So call this context and introduction to the arguments, okay? This is what the student has suggested. The bombing of Dresden by the Allied forces in World War II was and still is a very controversial event from history. Though Dresden originally was not a major industrial center or had much relevance to the military, as years in the war passed, it became increasingly important in wartime production and communication. As a result, it was chosen to be bombed. The results were devastating, thousands dying, city left in ruins. However, at this time, many of the inhabitants were civilians, including women, children, older people. So the bombing of Dresden not only caused the deaths of thousands of innocent people, but also broke American pre-war ethical doctrine, which included the military making only selective strikes in order to avoid deaths of German civilians. Thus, when evaluating the true effectiveness of the bombing in halting the wartime production and breaking communication, two arguments can be considered. The bombing of Dresden was effective in achieving these goals, or that the costs of the bombing outweighed the effects and therefore was not effective in achieving these goals. Okay, so this student has articulated two distinct arguments that get noted in the beginning of her analysis, and then she's going to kind of work with those two arguments throughout the analysis section. Okay, if you have like a broad discussion about everything under the sun related to your topic, you are not conducting kind of high-end analysis, right? So that ability to put your finger on these two arguments is really, really important, okay? It helps drive your paper in a very, very narrow way, okay? This second paragraph is where she's going to talk about the evaluation of sources. Two very important sources to this historical investigation include, this source by Frederick Taylor and this source, by Robert Schaeffer. In his novel, Taylor includes much evidence ranging from statistics, This provides a lot of value because it can be used when looking at the actual effect and changes of the bombing. What contributes to the value of this information? This guy is an historian who specializes in German history. In the journal article by Schaeffer, a lot of important evidence is also seen. Schaeffer mainly discusses American military ethics, events that contributed towards changing these ethics and how the ethics change when looking at the argument. Okay, so this student is focused on what her hypothesis is, right? It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks of these sources. How important are these sources to understanding her question? When looking at the argument that Dresden was not effective, one of the major points is that the bombing of the innocent civilians was morally unjust, and that this cost of breaking typical military ethics made the bombing of Dresden ineffective and unnecessary. So this information specifically on the ethics during this time would help determine whether the bombing's death toll of innocent civilians was worth the effect it had. Okay, what she's basically saying is, I looked at these two sources, and both of these sources are really good pieces of information for me to examine in order for me to be kind of focused on my question. And then she's going to take each argument one at a time. There's a large amount of evidence showing that the bombing of Dresden was very effective in achieving the goal of the Allied powers of halting wartime production. Okay, statistics show after the bombing, Dresden had no functioning telephone system. Germany's planned production of tanks and planes and trucks fell by 30 to 40%. Considering the direct effects on Dresden, it's clear bombing wiped out much of the industrial and communication support it provided to the war. Okay, so she's using some of these evidence pieces, right? In addition, she extends her analysis. Indirect effects of the bombing also contributed to achieving this goal. Okay, this is clear-cut analysis. She's not only saying that the bombing wiped out, the military, infrastructure of Dresden. She's also saying because the bombing happened, right, people had to switch large resources away from the fronts and had to use them to combat the bombing threat. So by bombing Dresden, resources flew to Dresden, and maybe that helped out the war effort other places. By 1944, a third of all German artillery production consisted of anti-aircraft guns. Okay, so in other words, anti-aircrafts were what Germany was all about producing, and that ultimately left them desperately short of resources for other tasks. Okay, this is good analysis on the part of this student because she has extended her argument, right? She's given the reader a variety of different kind of thinking ways about why this argument is actually a good argument. Okay, so there was an effectiveness of these bombing campaigns. One, it took out a lot of the resources, straight out. Second, it commanded a great deal of emphasis on Dresden and maybe, kind of enabled Ally success in other areas of the war, other geographic areas, okay? Because the resources from this military's offense were forced to change to support its defense, the overall military's offense was weakened as a result, okay? Basically, she then kind of deals with the, morality issue, that the main claim against this argument, the bombing was morally unjust, and this shows that either ethical standards were changing or that the bombings were completely necessary regardless of the morality of it all. Okay, then she handles the competing argument. On the other hand, there is much evidence to prove it was not effective in achieving the goal of the Allied powers to halting the wartime production. It's like she's having a debate with herself. Okay, one of the reasons is because the town of Dresden had no real military importance, right? Bombing it produced little effects. People were women, children, refugees. Within days of the bombing, a single track connection between these two places was established. 2 weeks later, the service was back to a reasonable level. As of the airstrikes, there's a pattern showing a string of high explosives to the southeast of the yards. But maybe the bombing didn't hit the parts that would have had the most important, kind of a military bang for the buck. So there is a whole bunch bunch of information too, you know, about the moral issues. The AF had a policy of avoiding indiscriminate attacks, you know, and after the bombing, you know, this was clear that these were broken, right? The American airmen were breaking their, you know, moral justifications of what they were supposed to do, okay? And then the very last part of the analysis, it is evident. Both arguments have evidence, however, and then she states, the argument that the bombing of Dresden was effective is more supported. And then this is her conclusion. Her conclusion is a few sentences